Ethan Murphy's hands trembled as he counted the last quarter in his palm. 473 total. Not enough. Grace lay unconscious in the back seat of his rusted pickup truck, her 7-year-old lips tinged blue in the fluorescent glow of Portland General's emergency entrance. The receptionist's voice cut through his desperation like glass. "Sir, we need a $5,000 deposit for emergency cardiac surgery." Two security guards stepped forward, their boots echoing against the sterile floor. Grace's breathing grew shallower. Ethan's world collapsed into a single, impossible moment, watching his daughter die because he couldn't afford to save her. "Put it on my card." The voice came from behind him, soft but commanding. Ethan spun around to see a woman in an expensive coat, rain-soaked and trembling, extending a platinum credit card with steady fingers. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Recognition of shared desperation, perhaps, or the weight of promises made to the dying. What neither of them knew was that this moment would cost them everything they thought they understood about love, sacrifice, and the price of keeping secrets. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Ethan Murphy had been a different man. The framed photo on his nightstand showed him in army dress blues, arm around Sarah, both of them grinning at something beyond the camera's reach. Grace, barely 5 then, sat perched on Sarah's hip, her chubby fingers reaching for the photographer. Back then, Ethan believed in the American dream. Work hard, serve your country, love your family, and everything would turn out fine. Cancer had other plans. Sarah's diagnosis came swift and merciless. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 6 months to live. The treatments that followed drained their savings faster than Ethan's military disability checks could replenish them. When the experimental therapy in Seattle offered hope, Ethan made a choice that would haunt him forever. He falsified insurance documents to cover the costs. Sarah lived 8 months longer than predicted, long enough to see Grace start first grade, long enough to make Ethan promise he'd find their daughter a mother who would love her unconditionally. The insurance fraud investigation began 2 weeks after Sarah's funeral. Now Ethan worked 3 jobs to keep their cramped apartment in southeast Portland. Mornings found him mopping floors at the downtown office complex, afternoons driving Uber in his failing pickup truck, and weekends swinging a hammer on construction sites. His hands, once steady enough to insert IVs under enemy fire in Fallujah, now shook from exhaustion and too much coffee. Grace Murphy was 7 years old and wiser than most adults. Born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, she'd undergone 2 major surgeries before her 3rd birthday. The 3rd surgery, the one that would give her a chance at a normal life, required $150,000 up front. Without it, Grace's cardiologist had gently explained, she wouldn't see her 10th birthday. Dr. Martinez had been kind but clear during their last appointment. Grace needs the Fontan completion within the next year. Her oxygen saturation is dropping. The longer we wait, the greater the risk. Ethan nodded like he understood, like he had options, like he wasn't drowning in medical debt from Grace's previous surgeries. Grace sat on the examination table, swinging her thin legs, humming a song Sarah used to sing. She understood more about her condition than any 7-year-old should, could recite her medications and their dosages, knew when her lips turned blue it meant her heart was working too hard. At night, after Grace fell asleep in the bedroom they couldn't afford to furnish properly, Ethan sat at their second-hand table calculating impossible math. Even with insurance, when it decided to cooperate, the surgery would cost them everything. The medical bills, already scattered across their kitchen counter, told the story of a man slowly losing a war against time and money. Grace drew pictures constantly, always the same subject, a family of 3, sometimes 4. When Ethan asked about the extra figure, Grace would shrug and say, "That's the mommy angel. She comes in my dreams and tells me stories." The drawings went on the refrigerator next to Sarah's final note. "Take care of our miracle. She's stronger than she looks." Every morning, Ethan kissed Grace goodbye and wondered if this would be the day his daughter's heart finally gave up fighting. The morning after Grace's emergency surgery, Ethan sat in the hospital cafeteria staring at a cup of coffee he couldn't afford. 48 hours had passed since the mysterious woman, Victoria, she'd finally told him, had saved his daughter's life with a single swipe of her credit card. The surgery had been successful, but Grace would need weeks of recovery and follow-up care that would cost thousands more. Victoria appeared in the cafeteria doorway, scanning the room until her eyes found his. She looked different in daylight, younger, more uncertain. Gone was the confident woman who had commanded the emergency room staff. In her place stood someone who seemed as lost as he felt. "How is she?" Victoria asked, sliding into the chair across from him. "Stable. The doctors say the surgery went perfectly." Ethan studied her face, searching for answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Why did you do it?" "You don't even know us." Victoria's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. "I lost my mother when I was 8. I know what it's like to feel helpless in a hospital. The truth, but not the whole truth. No child should die because their parent can't afford to save them." Over the next 3 weeks, Victoria became a constant presence in their lives. She appeared at the apartment each morning with grocery bags and children's books, claiming she was between jobs and had time to help. Grace, recovering slowly but steadily, was enchanted by this elegant woman who read stories with funny voices and braided her hair in complicated patterns. Ethan watched Victoria struggle with simple tasks. She burned their first attempt at pancakes, couldn't figure out how to work the washing machine, and seemed genuinely amazed that people bought generic brands at the grocery store. When he taught her to drive his battered pickup truck, she gripped the steering wheel like she was piloting a spaceship. "I grew up in the city," she explained when he asked about her sheltered upbringing. "Private schools, very protected environment." The lies came easily now, each one building on the last. Victoria told herself she was protecting them, that revealing her true identity would only complicate things. She paid for groceries with cash from her emergency fund, claiming she'd been saving birthday money for years. When Grace needed new school clothes, Victoria produced a crisp $100 bill, saying her aunt had sent it. Ethan's pride warred with his desperation. He needed help but hated accepting what felt like charity. Victoria seemed to understand this delicate balance, never offering money directly, always finding ways to contribute that preserved his dignity. She insisted on paying rent for the couch where she slept, though Ethan suspected the amount she gave him was far more than any reasonable person would pay for sleeping arrangements. Grace blossomed under Victoria's attention. The quiet, serious child who had carried the weight of her medical condition with heartbreaking maturity began to laugh again. She taught Victoria to play with her dolls, showed her how to make friendship bracelets, and drew pictures of their family, always 3 people now, sometimes with a mysterious 4th figure labeled Grandpa in Grace's careful printing. "Who's the grandpa?" Ethan asked one evening, studying Grace's latest artwork. Grace shrugged with the casual wisdom of childhood. "Vicky's dad. He's sad because he misses her grandma. That's why Vicky came to live with us, so she wouldn't be lonely anymore." The conversation made Victoria excuse herself to the bathroom, where Ethan later found her crying silently. He didn't ask questions, just handed her a tissue and waited. "I've never had a family like this," she whispered. "I didn't know it could feel so normal." Their first kiss happened 3 weeks later, after Grace's follow-up appointment brought excellent news. Victoria had insisted on coming along, had held Grace's hand during the examination, had celebrated with them when Dr. Martinez declared the surgery a complete success. Walking back to the truck in the hospital parking lot, Grace skipping ahead of them, Victoria suddenly stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me be part of this. Thank you for saving her life." The kiss was gentle, hesitant, flavored with hope and fear in equal measure. Grace turned around just in time to witness it, clapping her hands with delight. "Does this mean Vicky can stay forever?" Grace asked. Neither adult answered immediately. The question hung in the evening air, weighted with possibilities neither dared to fully examine. Victoria's phone, tucked in her jacket pocket, buzzed with another message from her father's private investigators. She ignored it, as she had ignored dozens of similar messages over the past month. That night, after Grace was asleep, Ethan and Victoria sat on the couch, talking in whispers. Victoria learned about Sarah, about the insurance fraud that had left Ethan blacklisted from most medical coverage. Ethan learned about Victoria's lonely childhood, though she kept the details deliberately vague. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life," Victoria confessed, "but it's the first time I've ever felt like myself." 3 weeks later, Ethan found himself believing in possibilities he'd thought were buried with Sarah. Victoria had seamlessly woven herself into their daily routines, walking Grace to school each morning, helping with homework at their small kitchen table, learning to navigate the second-hand grocery stores where every dollar mattered. She approached these mundane tasks with the concentration of someone learning a foreign language, which, in many ways, she was. The first crack in Victoria's carefully constructed facade appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. Grace had been invited to a classmate's birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese, and Victoria offered to take her. Ethan watched from the kitchen window as Victoria stood beside his rusted pickup truck for nearly 5 minutes, staring at the door handle like it might bite her. "Everything okay?" he called out. "Fine." Victoria's voice was pitched higher than usual. "Just checking something." When they returned 3 hours later, Grace was chattering excitedly about arcade games and pizza, but Victoria looked shell-shocked. She sat heavily on their second-hand couch, her usually perfect posture gone. "Rough afternoon?" Ethan asked, settling beside her. Victoria laughed, but it sounded forced. I haven't been to a place like that since I was very young. It's overwhelming. All those families, all that noise and joy and chaos." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I grew up quite isolated." The explanation was true, though incomplete. What she couldn't tell him was that she'd panicked at the sight of so many parents casually spending $50 on their children's entertainment, money that represented nearly a day's wages for Ethan. She'd watched a mother complain about the cheap party favors, while Grace carefully saved every ticket from the arcade games, treating each one like treasure. That evening, as they tucked Grace into bed, the little girl made an announcement that stopped both adults cold. "I'm going to marry Tommy Brennan," she declared with 7-year-old certainty. "Oh, really?" Ethan played along. "And why's that?" "Because his daddy has a boat, and his mommy doesn't have to work 3 jobs like you do." Grace's innocent observation landed like a physical blow. "If I marry Tommy, we can all live in their big house, and you won't be so tired all the time." After Grace fell asleep, Ethan sat at their kitchen table with his head in his hands. Victoria found him there an hour later, surrounded by medical bills and past-due notices. "She knows," he said without looking up. "She knows we're barely hanging on, and she's trying to fix it. A 7-year-old is trying to solve our financial problems by marrying into money." Victoria's heart clenched. She could solve everything with a single phone call, could give Grace the childhood she deserved, could lift this crushing weight from Ethan's shoulders. Instead, she sat across from him and did what she'd learned to do in this strange new world. She listened. "Sarah always said Grace was too smart for her own good," Ethan continued. "She sees everything, understands more than she should. Sometimes I catch her counting pills when she thinks I'm not looking, making sure she's not taking too much medicine because she knows how much it costs." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Ethan frowned. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and they rarely had visitors. He opened the door to find Mrs. Rodriguez from the apartment next door, her face creased with worry. "Mijo, there's been cars parked outside all week," she said in her accented English. "Different ones, but always watching your place. You in some kind of trouble?" Victoria's blood ran cold. She'd noticed the surveillance but had hoped it was her imagination, wishful thinking that her father hadn't yet tracked her down. Ethan immediately went to the window, and Victoria saw his military training kick in as he scanned the street with practiced eyes. "There," he said quietly. "Black sedan. 2 men inside. They've been there since yesterday, but I thought they were waiting for someone else." Victoria's mind raced. She had to protect them, had to find a way to explain without revealing everything. There was some trouble with my previous living situation," she said carefully. "An ex-boyfriend who doesn't want to accept that it's over. He's been having me followed." The lie came easier than she expected, built on a foundation of partial truths. She had been fleeing an unwanted relationship, just not a romantic one. Ethan's expression darkened. "How serious is this trouble?" "Serious enough that I should probably leave," Victoria whispered, the words tearing at her throat. "I don't want to put you and Grace in danger." "Like hell you're leaving!" Ethan's voice carried the steel of command he'd used in the army. "Nobody threatens my family." The word family hung in the air between them, acknowledged for the first time. Victoria felt tears threatening as she realized how desperately she wanted to belong to that word, to be part of something larger than herself. That night, Ethan insisted Victoria sleep in Grace's room while he kept watch from the living room. As she lay on the small air mattress beside Grace's bed, listening to the child's steady breathing, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She quietly retrieved her phone and composed a text message to her father's head of security. "I'm safe. I'm happy. Please stop looking for me." The response came within minutes. "Your father has been ill with worry. Come home immediately or we will be forced to involve the authorities." Victoria stared at the screen for a long time before typing her reply. "I am home." She turned off the phone and removed the battery, knowing it was probably too late. They likely already had her exact location. But for tonight, in this small apartment filled with the quiet sounds of a loving family, she could pretend that love might be enough to keep the outside world at bay. In the living room, Ethan sat by the window with a baseball bat across his knees, watching the street and wondering how a woman who claimed to be running from an ex-boyfriend could afford to pay Grace's medical bills. The surveillance cars vanished the next morning, but the damage was done. Victoria moved through their apartment like a woman waiting for an executioner, jumping at every sound, checking the windows obsessively. Ethan watched her deteriorate with growing concern, his military instincts telling him there was far more to her story than a troublesome ex-boyfriend. The breaking point came 3 days later at Grace's school pickup. Victoria was waiting in the designated parent area when a black SUV pulled up across the street. 2 men in expensive suits climbed out, one of them pointing a telephoto camera lens directly at her. Victoria's face went white as paper. "Get down," she whispered urgently to the other parents around her, her voice carrying a panic that made several mothers step back in alarm. But instead of approaching, the men simply photographed her for several minutes before driving away. Victoria stood frozen in place until Grace ran up, school backpack bouncing, chattering about her art project. "Vicky, you look sick," Grace said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Are you going to leave us like Mommy did?" The question shattered something inside Victoria. That evening, after Grace was asleep, she sat Ethan down at their small kitchen table and tried to explain without explaining. "My family has money," she began carefully. "A lot of money. I ran away because they wanted me to marry someone I didn't love, someone who only wanted me for what I could bring to his political career." She twisted her hands in her lap. "They're not going to stop looking for me." Ethan absorbed this information with the stoic expression he'd perfected during his military service. "How much money are we talking about?" "Enough to buy this entire neighborhood," Victoria whispered. "Enough to pay for Grace's medical care without blinking. Enough to make your life infinitely easier." "But you didn't tell me." His voice was carefully neutral, but Victoria could hear the hurt underneath. "Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "And because I knew that if you found out, you'd either run away thinking you weren't good enough or stay for the wrong reasons." Ethan was quiet for a long time, processing. When he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than anger would have. "Do you know what the worst part is? Not that you lied about having money. It's that you didn't trust me enough to tell the truth." That weekend, Victoria's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Grace had been looking forward to a school field trip to the zoo, but the permission slip required a $25 fee that Ethan simply didn't have. Victoria watched him explain to Grace that they couldn't afford it, watched their daughter nod with the heartbreaking understanding of a child who had learned not to ask for things. "I could pay for it," Victoria offered quietly when Grace was out of earshot. "No." Ethan's response was immediate and firm. "We've taken enough from you." "It's $25, Ethan, less than you spend on coffee in a week." "I don't spend $25 on coffee in a month," he snapped, and Victoria realized how completely she had misunderstood their financial reality. The argument that followed was their first real fight, years of class differences and unspoken resentments boiling over in their tiny kitchen. "You want to help? Really help?" Ethan's voice rose dangerously. "Then stop pretending to be something you're not. Stop acting like you understand what it's like to choose between medicine for your sick child and groceries. Stop making me feel like a charity case in my own home." "That's not what I'm doing," Victoria protested, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. "Isn't it? You pay for groceries with mysterious birthday money? You somehow afford designer clothes but claim to shop at thrift stores. You know more about Grace's medical condition than most doctors, but you've never mentioned having medical training." Ethan's military bearing was in full evidence now, his voice controlled but deadly serious. "Who are you, Victoria? Really?" Before she could answer, Grace appeared in the kitchen doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't fight," she whispered. "Please don't make Vicky leave. I'll be good, I promise. I don't need to go to the zoo." The sight of Grace begging them not to break up their makeshift family destroyed whatever was left of Victoria's composure. She knelt down and pulled the little girl into her arms, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "You're perfect, sweetheart. This isn't about you being good or bad. Sometimes grown-ups just have complicated feelings." That night, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She waited until she was certain Ethan and Grace were asleep, then quietly retrieved her laptop from her duffel bag. For the first time in 2 months, she accessed her real bank account. The numbers on the screen represented more money than Ethan would earn in several lifetimes. With a few keystrokes, she could solve every problem they faced. Grace's medical bills, Ethan's debt, their cramped living situation, all of it could disappear instantly. Instead, she composed an email to her accountant requesting a modest trust fund to be established anonymously for Grace's medical care. Not enough to raise suspicions, but enough to ensure the little girl would never again be denied treatment because of money. As she typed, Victoria didn't notice Ethan standing in the doorway behind her, couldn't see the expression on his face as he took in the luxury laptop, the bank balance visible on the screen, the ease with which she navigated what was clearly familiar financial territory. He said nothing, just returned quietly to the living room where he spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling and wondering if anything about their relationship had been real. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Dr. Martinez called early, his voice grave with concern. Grace's latest blood work showed signs that her heart was working harder than it should. The Fontan completion surgery couldn't wait much longer. "We need to schedule it within the next month," he said. "I know the financial situation is challenging, but Grace's condition is deteriorating faster than we hoped." Victoria watched Ethan's face crumble as he listened to the doctor's words. When he hung up the phone, he sat heavily at their kitchen table and put his head in his hands. "I can't lose her," he whispered. "I can't fail Sarah again." This time, Victoria didn't hesitate. "I'm calling my family." "Victoria, no. We'll find another way." "What other way?" she demanded. "You've already sold everything you own. You're working yourself to death at 3 jobs. There is no other way, and you know it." The phone call to her father was the hardest thing Victoria had ever done. She dialed the private number she knew by heart, the one that bypassed all assistants and secretaries, and waited for the familiar voice. "Victoria Elizabeth Sterling." William Sterling's voice was cold with fury and relief in equal measure. "Do you have any idea what you've put me through?" "Hello, Dad." 3 months, Victoria. 3 months of not knowing if you were alive or dead. The police have been useless. I've had private investigators scouring the entire West Coast." Victoria closed her eyes, steeling herself for what came next. "I need your help." The silence stretched so long she wondered if the call had been dropped. When William finally spoke, his voice carried a satisfaction that made her stomach turn. "I see. And what exactly do you need my help with?" "There's a little girl who needs heart surgery. Her father can't afford it. I want to pay for it, but I don't have access to my accounts." "A little girl." William's tone was carefully neutral. "Anyone I should know about?" Victoria looked through the kitchen doorway to where Grace sat on the living room floor, carefully coloring within the lines of a princess coloring book. Ethan was beside her, helping her choose which crayon to use next, both of them pretending they hadn't overheard her end of the phone conversation. "Her name is Grace Murphy. She's 7 years old, and she's the most amazing kid you'll ever meet. Her father is a good man, Dad, the best man I've ever known." "I see." Another long pause. "And where exactly have you been living for the past 3 months?" Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. With them, as a family. The explosion of rage that followed was everything she had expected, and worse. William Sterling had built a technology empire through ruthless determination and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The idea that his daughter had been living in poverty, playing house with strangers, was beyond his comprehension. "You will come home immediately," he commanded when his initial fury had spent itself. "I will arrange for the child's medical care, but this nonsense ends today." "It's not nonsense, Dad. I love them." "You think you love them. You're confusing gratitude with genuine emotion. These people took advantage of a confused, vulnerable young woman. They saved me. They manipulated you. But this is my fault. I should have found you sooner." William's voice took on the tone he used in boardroom negotiations, calm and implacable. "Here's what's going to happen. You will return home today. I will pay for the child's surgery. In return, you will never contact this family again. And if I refuse, then the child dies, and you'll have to live with that choice for the rest of your life. The ultimatum hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria looked again at Grace and Ethan, at the family she had found in the most unlikely place, and realized she had no choice at all. "I'll be home by evening," she whispered. "Good. My driver will pick you up wherever you are." After she hung up, Victoria sat for a long time at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. She could hear Grace and Ethan talking quietly in the living room, their voices mixing in the comfortable rhythm of a father and daughter who had learned to find joy in small moments. When she finally emerged from the kitchen, she found them building a blanket fort, Grace's medical equipment incorporated into the architecture like it was just another building material. "Can we sleep in here tonight?" Grace asked excitedly. "All three of us?" Victoria felt her heart break clean in half. "I think that sounds perfect, sweetheart." She didn't tell them about the phone call, didn't mention that this would be their last night together. Instead, she helped them build the best blanket fort in the history of blanket forts and tried to memorize every laugh, every touch, every moment of perfect, impossible happiness. Tomorrow she would return to her gilded cage. Tonight she would be Grace's Vicky and Ethan's beloved, and she would pretend that love could conquer everything, even money. The black town car arrived at exactly 8 o'clock the next evening, idling outside their apartment building like a predator waiting to strike. Victoria had spent the day in a haze of last moments, teaching Grace to braid friendship bracelets, helping Ethan fix the leaky kitchen faucet, memorizing the way afternoon light fell across their small living room. She had packed nothing except the clothes she'd arrived in 3 months ago, leaving behind the life she'd built with careful, desperate hands. Grace sensed something was wrong with the intuition of a child who had learned to read adult emotions for survival. She clung to Victoria's legs as the car waited outside, her small fingers twisted in the fabric of Victoria's thrift store dress. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Grace's voice was small and certain, like Mommy did. Victoria knelt to Grace's eye level, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make very hard choices, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean we stop loving you. Mommy said that too before she went to heaven." Grace's matter-of-fact delivery broke Victoria's heart all over again. "Are you going to heaven too?" "No, baby. I'm going home to my father. He's been very worried about me." Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the goodbye with an expression Victoria couldn't read. They hadn't spoken about her leaving. There was nothing left to say. He knew, as she did, that some chasms couldn't be bridged by love alone. The drive to the Sterling penthouse took 40 minutes through Portland's evening traffic, but Victoria experienced it as both an eternity and an instant. The driver, one of her father's regular employees, maintained professional silence while Victoria stared out the window at the city she was leaving behind. Each familiar landmark felt like another small death. The Sterling building rose 60 floors into the Portland sky, a gleaming monument to technological innovation and her father's relentless ambition. Victoria had grown up in the penthouse that occupied the top 3 floors, but as the private elevator carried her upward, she felt like she was ascending to her own execution. William Sterling stood waiting in the marble foyer, his silver hair perfectly styled, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the late hour. At 68, he commanded every room he entered with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to absolute control. But Victoria noticed what others might miss: the slight tremor in his left hand, the way he held his head at an angle that suggested he was working to maintain focus. "Victoria," his voice carried relief and fury in equal measure. "Hello, Father." They stood facing each other across the polished marble, the distance between them measuring more than physical space. William's sharp eyes took in every detail of her appearance: the faded jeans she'd bought at Goodwill, the simple cotton sweater that had belonged to Sarah Murphy, the absence of jewelry or makeup that had once been as natural to her as breathing. "You look thin," he said finally, "and tired." "I look happy," Victoria replied. "Or I did until an hour ago." William gestured toward the living room, a space that could have housed 3 families the size of Ethan and Grace's. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Portland's glittering skyline. But Victoria found herself thinking of the view from the Murphy apartment, a parking lot, and the neighbor's laundry line, but somehow infinitely more beautiful. "We need to discuss what happens next," William began, settling into his leather chair with the careful movements of someone fighting an invisible enemy. "I've already arranged for the child's surgery, Doctor. Pemberton at OHSU is the finest pediatric cardiac surgeon on the West Coast. The procedure is scheduled for next week." Victoria felt a wave of gratitude and resentment crash over her simultaneously. "Thank you. I'm also establishing a medical trust fund for her ongoing care she'll never want for treatment." William's tone was businesslike, as if he were discussing quarterly reports rather than a 7-year-old's life. "In return, you will have no further contact with the Murphy family. They have names, Father, Ethan and Grace. They're not just the Murphy family. They are strangers who took advantage of my daughter's temporary instability." William's voice hardened. "Do you think this man would have looked twice at you if he'd known you were homeless and penniless? Of course not. He saw an opportunity and exploited it." Victoria stood abruptly, pacing to the windows that had once made her feel like she was floating above the world. Now they felt like prison bars. "You don't understand. Ethan didn't know who I was. He helped me because that's who he is. A good man who helps people in need. A good man who's been living off your charity for months while pretending to be the provider." William's clinical assessment cut deep because it contained a grain of truth. "You paid for his daughter's surgery, his groceries, his rent. He may not have known your name, but he certainly benefited from your resources. I wanted to help them, because you've been playing house with other people's lives." William rose from his chair, his movements betraying a slight unsteadiness that Victoria was sure only she would notice. "You're 28 years old, Victoria. You have responsibilities to our company, to our family legacy, to your own future. You can't spend your life hiding in working-class fantasies." The argument that followed was everything Victoria had expected, and worse. William had built his empire through ruthless pragmatism and an absolute conviction that he knew what was best for everyone around him. The idea that his carefully groomed daughter preferred a cramped apartment to a penthouse, chosen family to blood relations, was beyond his comprehension. "I've arranged for you to resume your position as Vice President of Strategic Development," he continued when his initial storm had passed. "The board meeting is Monday morning. You'll need new clothes. I've scheduled appointments with your usual designers. I don't want to go back to Sterling Tech. What you want is irrelevant. What you need is to remember who you are." Victoria turned from the windows to face her father, seeing him clearly for the first time in years. He stood with military precision, but she noticed how he gripped the back of his chair for support, the way his eyes occasionally lost focus before snapping back to attention. The great William Sterling, master of his universe, was fighting a war he couldn't win. "You're getting worse, aren't you?" she said quietly. "The Alzheimer's?" William's facade cracked almost imperceptibly. "That's not your concern." "Of course it's my concern. You're my father." Victoria's anger transformed into something more complex. Grief for the relationship they'd never had, fear for what was coming, love complicated by years of control and rebellion. "Is that why you're so desperate to get me back? Because you're scared of forgetting me?" "I'm scared of losing you the way I lost your mother." The admission escaped before William could stop it, raw and vulnerable in a way that shocked them both. Victoria had been 8 when Margaret Sterling died in a car accident that was no accident at all. Her mother had been struggling with early-onset Alzheimer's, a diagnosis the family had kept carefully hidden. On a rare lucid day, Margaret had taken her car keys and driven to the coast, intending to walk into the ocean rather than burden her family with her slow disappearance. She never made it to the beach. The accident happened on Highway 101, a single-car collision that looked exactly like what it was, a desperate woman choosing death over the loss of herself. "Mom didn't leave because she stopped loving us," Victoria said. "She left because she couldn't bear the thought of us watching her disappear. And I've spent 20 years trying to prevent that from happening again." William's voice was barely above a whisper. "I couldn't save her, but I can save you." "Save me from what? From being happy? From finding love? From having a family that actually talks to each other? From throwing your life away on people who can never give you what you deserve?" The conversation was interrupted by William's phone buzzing with an urgent message. As he read it, his face went ashen. "What is it?" Victoria asked. William showed her the screen, a news alert from Portland General Hospital. There had been a complication with one of the scheduled surgeries. A 7-year-old girl named Grace Murphy had been rushed into emergency surgery when her condition suddenly deteriorated. Victoria's world tilted on its axis. "I have to go to them." "Absolutely not. She might be dying, and they're facing it alone. The child will receive the best possible care. I've made sure of that." "That's not the same thing as having someone who loves you hold your hand." Victoria was already moving toward the elevator, her father's protests falling on deaf ears. "If you leave now, you're choosing them over me," William called after her. "I won't make this offer again." Victoria paused with her hand on the elevator button, her reflection multiplied in the polished metal doors. In that fractured image, she saw all the versions of herself she'd been and could be: the dutiful daughter, the corporate executive, the woman who had found herself in a cramped apartment with a man and child who loved her without conditions. "I know," she said, without turning around. The elevator doors closed between them with a soft whisper, carrying Victoria away from everything she'd been born to and toward everything she'd chosen to become. As the floors counted down toward the lobby, she tried not to think about the tremor in her father's hands or the fear in his eyes. Some choices were too important to be made from guilt, even when love complicated everything. By the time she reached the lobby, Victoria had made peace with her decision. She would return to the hospital, would stand vigil beside Ethan while Grace fought for her life, would face whatever came next with the family she'd chosen rather than the one that had chosen her. Outside, Portland's November rain had begun to fall, washing the city clean for whatever would come next. Victoria arrived at Portland General Hospital to find Ethan pacing the surgical waiting room like a caged animal, his work clothes still stained with the day's labor, his face etched with a terror she recognized from her own mirror. He looked up when she burst through the doors, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "How is she?" Victoria's voice came out as a whisper. "They don't know yet." Her heart started failing during a routine checkup this afternoon. Dr. Martinez said something about fluid buildup, complications from the previous surgery. Ethan's words tumbled out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would make them less real. "They've been operating for 3 hours. Victoria sank into the plastic chair beside him, the institutional furniture a stark contrast to the leather and marble she'd left behind. "I'm so sorry. I should never have left." "You came back." Ethan's voice carried a complex mixture of relief and confusion. "Your father can go to hell." The vehemence in Victoria's voice surprised them both. "This is where I belong, with you and Grace, whatever happens." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of medical equipment. The waiting room was painted in soothing blues and greens, with inspirational posters about hope and healing. But Victoria had never felt farther from comfort. "The insurance company called," Ethan said eventually. "Grace's policy was canceled. Apparently, they've been investigating my previous claims, found irregularities." Victoria's heart sank. She knew exactly what irregularities they'd found. The documents Ethan had altered years ago to pay for Sarah's experimental treatment. The fraud that had been quietly overlooked was now being weaponized. Which means what exactly? Which means, if she survives tonight, we're looking at hundreds of thousands in medical debt. "The kind that follows you for the rest of your life," Ethan laughed bitterly. "I mortgaged everything to pay for Sarah's treatment, and now I can't even provide basic coverage for Grace." "Money doesn't matter right now. Money is the only thing that matters right now." Ethan's voice cracked with exhaustion and despair. "You know what I was thinking when they wheeled her into surgery? Not about whether she'd make it through the night, but about how I'd pay for her funeral if she doesn't." The brutal honesty of his confession hung between them. Victoria reached for his hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of physical labor, the slight tremor of a man pushed past his breaking point. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Whatever it costs, we'll find a way." "We?" Ethan pulled his hand away gently. "Victoria, you've got a trust fund that could buy this hospital. I've got nothing but debt and a pickup truck that needs a new transmission." Before Victoria could respond, Dr. Martinez appeared in the waiting room doorway, still wearing his surgical scrubs. His expression was carefully neutral in the way doctors learned when delivering news that could destroy lives. "Mr. Murphy? Miss Sterling?" Victoria started at the use of her real name, then realized her father's influence had reached even here. Dr. Martinez gestured for them to follow him to a private consultation room, and Victoria felt her stomach clench with dread. "Grace made it through the surgery," he began, and both adults exhaled in relief. "But I need to be honest with you about what we found. The previous repair is failing faster than we anticipated. Her heart is working at roughly 30% capacity." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked. "It means Grace needs a heart transplant soon." Dr. Martinez pulled out a tablet, showing them images Victoria couldn't begin to interpret. "Without it, she has perhaps 6 months to live. With it, she could have a completely normal lifespan." The room seemed to spin around Victoria. She gripped the edge of her chair, fighting waves of nausea. "How much?" Ethan's voice was barely audible. "The transplant surgery itself runs about $400,000. Post-operative care, immunosuppressive drugs, follow-up treatments. We're looking at close to $1 million over the first 5 years." Ethan made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. $1 million. For a man who can't afford his daughter's school lunch. "There are programs," Dr. Martinez said gently. "Charity care, medical grants, and, Ms. Sterling, given your family's resources." "No." Ethan's response was immediate and firm. "We're not taking Sterling money." Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "Ethan, this is Grace's life we're talking about." "This is exactly what I'm talking about." "You swooping in with your family's fortune to solve problems that the rest of us have to live with." Ethan stood abruptly, pacing to the small window that looked out over the hospital parking lot. "Do you know what it's like to love someone you can never repay? To know that every day of your daughter's life is bought and paid for by someone else's charity? It's not charity. I love her. I love both of you. Love doesn't change the fact that you have options I'll never have. Love doesn't erase the fundamental inequality between us." Ethan turned back to face her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sarah made me promise to find Grace a mother who would love her. She didn't say anything about finding her a mother who could afford to keep her alive. Dr. Martinez cleared his throat diplomatically. I'll leave you two to discuss this. Grace is stable for now, and you can see her once she's moved to recovery. Take your time with these decisions. They don't have to be made tonight. After he left, Victoria and Ethan sat in the small consultation room, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on them. Through the thin walls, they could hear the sounds of the hospital at night. Soft conversations, the squeak of gurney wheels, the distant cry of a newborn baby taking its first breaths. I can't do this, Ethan said finally. I can't be the father who lets his child die because of pride, and I can't be the man who lives off his girlfriend's trust fund for the rest of his life. Those aren't the only options, aren't they? Ethan's laugh was bitter. Your father was right, Victoria. We're from different worlds. I work 3 jobs and still can't afford to keep my daughter alive. You spend more on shoes than I make in a month. How exactly do we build a life together on that foundation? Victoria felt something breaking inside her chest, a pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. So, what are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time for you to go back to your world and let me figure out how to survive in mine. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She had expected anger, disappointment, even resentment. She hadn't expected dismissal. You want me to leave? Now? When Grace is fighting for her life? I want you to be realistic about what this is. You've been playing house with us for 3 months, but this is real life. This is what it looks like when you don't have unlimited resources to throw at problems. Ethan's voice was steady now, resigned. Grace needs more than love to survive. She needs medical care that costs more money than I'll make in my entire lifetime. Then let me help. At what cost? My self-respect? Grace's understanding of her own worth? What happens when she grows up knowing that she only survived because someone else's money kept her alive? Victoria stood abruptly, her own anger finally matching his. You know what, Ethan? You're right. We are from different worlds. In my world, when someone you love is dying, you do whatever it takes to save them. You don't let pride get in the way of keeping your child alive. And in my world, we don't assume money solves everything. Well, maybe your world is wrong. The words escaped before Victoria could stop them, cruel and cutting in a way that couldn't be taken back. Ethan flinched as if she'd struck him. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet and final. Maybe it is, but it's the only world I know how to live in. They stood facing each other across the small room, the distance between them measuring more than physical space. Outside in the hallway, a nurse was paging Dr. Martinez to pediatric ICU, and Victoria realized their conversation was over. I'll have my father establish the medical trust anonymously, she said, her voice professionally neutral. Grace will have everything she needs. You won't have to see me or take money directly. Victoria, no, you're right. We're from different worlds, and maybe that's insurmountable. Victoria gathered her purse, her movements careful and controlled. But I won't let Grace pay the price for our incompatibility. She paused at the door, looking back at the man she'd thought she might spend her life with. For what it's worth, I never saw you as a charity case. I saw you as the first person who ever loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. But maybe that's not enough. As Victoria walked down the hospital corridor toward the elevator, she passed the pediatric ICU where Grace lay sleeping, surrounded by machines that kept her small heart beating. Through the glass, she looked impossibly tiny and fragile, her dark hair spread across the pillow like a halo. Victoria pressed her palm against the glass, whispering promises Grace couldn't hear. She would make sure the little girl had everything she needed to survive and thrive. She would love her from a distance the way her father had learned to love her, fiercely, protectively, and from entirely too far away. The elevator doors opened, and Victoria stepped inside, leaving behind the only family she had ever chosen, and returning to the one that had always owned her. Some kinds of love, she realized, were too expensive for anyone to afford. 3 months passed like a slow-motion disaster. Victoria returned to Sterling Tech as if the previous months had been nothing more than an elaborate dream, sliding back into board meetings and strategic planning sessions with the practiced ease of someone born to corporate warfare. Her corner office on the 58th floor offered a panoramic view of Portland, and on clear days she could see the neighborhood where the Murphy family lived their careful, constrained life. William Sterling watched his daughter's return with satisfaction tinged by concern. Victoria performed her duties flawlessly. She negotiated contracts, managed acquisitions, and represented Sterling Tech at industry conferences with the polished competence he had spent years cultivating in her. But she moved through her days like an automaton, her smiles perfectly calibrated for business purposes, her conversations limited to quarterly projections and market analysis. "You're not eating," he observed one evening as they shared their customary dinner in the penthouse dining room. The table could seat 20, but they sat at opposite ends, their voices echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "I'm fine." Victoria's response was automatic, delivered without looking up from her tablet where she was reviewing financial reports. "You've lost 15 pounds since you came home." "I've been working out more." Another lie, delivered with the same mechanical precision as her business presentations. William studied his daughter with the clinical assessment that had made him billions in technology investments. Victoria had inherited her mother's delicate bone structure, but Margaret had possessed a vitality that lit up every room she entered. The woman sitting across from him was a carefully constructed replica, beautiful but hollow. "The Murphy child is doing well," he said carefully. "The medical trust has covered all her expenses. She's been accepted into the transplant program at OHSU. Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth, the only sign that she'd heard him. "Good. Would you like to know more details?" "No." William had built his empire on his ability to read people, to identify their motivations and leverage their desires. But his daughter had become unreadable, armored in professional competence and emotional distance. He recognized the symptoms because he'd perfected them himself in the years following Margaret's death. The careful compartmentalization, the focus on work as an escape from feeling, the gradual erosion of everything that made life worth living. Meanwhile, 15 miles across the city, Ethan Murphy was discovering that noble gestures came with a price he hadn't anticipated. The anonymous medical trust had indeed covered Grace's expenses, but it had also created a strange limbo in their lives. Grace was thriving physically. Her doctors were optimistic about her placement on the transplant list, but she asked about Victoria constantly. "Is Vicky ever coming back?" Grace would inquire over breakfast, her 7-year-old logic struggling to understand why someone who claimed to love them would simply disappear. "I don't know, sweetheart," became Ethan's standard response, though the uncertainty was killing him. Mrs. Rodriguez, their neighbor, had become Grace's unofficial grandmother, stepping in to help with childcare when Ethan's work schedule became impossible. She was a practical woman in her 60s who had raised 5 children and possessed the no-nonsense wisdom that comes from surviving decades of poverty and perseverance. "You're an idiot," she told Ethan one afternoon as they watched Grace play in the small courtyard behind their building. "Thanks for the pep talk, Mrs. R." "I'm serious, mijo. That woman loved you both, really loved you. And you threw it away because your pride couldn't handle being helped." Ethan watched Grace carefully stack rocks into elaborate towers, her tongue poking out in concentration. She looked healthier than she had in months, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before Victoria left. It wasn't just about pride. We're from different worlds. Eventually, she would have realized that. Different worlds, Mrs. Rodriguez snorted. You know what I see? I see a man who's so afraid of not being enough that he won't let himself be loved. And I see a little girl who's paying the price for her father's fear. The conversation was interrupted by Grace's excited shout. Daddy, look! She had successfully balanced the largest rock on top of her tower, creating a precarious structure that defied gravity through careful engineering and determination. That's amazing, baby girl. Vicky taught me how to balance things, Grace said matter-of-factly. She said sometimes the biggest pieces need to go on the bottom to hold everything up, but sometimes they can go on top if you're really careful about the foundation. Ethan felt the familiar ache in his chest that came with every reminder of Victoria's absence. She had been good for Grace in ways he hadn't fully appreciated until she was gone. More than that, she had been good for him, challenging his assumptions about worth and value and what it meant to provide for a family. The truth he couldn't admit to Mrs. Rodriguez or even fully to himself was that he missed Victoria desperately. Not just her help with Grace or the financial stability she'd brought, but her laugh when she burned dinner, her determination to master mundane tasks that most people took for granted, the way she'd looked at him like he was someone worth loving completely. But missing someone and being able to build a life with them were two different things. The medical trust that paid for Grace's care was a constant reminder of the gulf between their resources. Every appointment, every prescription, every medical test was a debt he could never repay, a weight on his conscience that grew heavier each day. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in February. Grace had just finished her homework when she made an announcement that stopped Ethan's heart. I wrote a letter to Vicky, she said, holding up a piece of construction paper covered in her careful second-grade handwriting. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me with the spelling. Ethan read the letter over Grace's shoulder, his throat tightening with each word. Dear Vicky, I miss you every day. Daddy says you had to go back to your real family, but I thought we were your real family too. Are you still my almost mommy? I hope your heart doesn't hurt like mine does. I'm getting stronger every day. The doctors say I might get a new heart soon. I want you to know that I'll take really good care of it, and I'll think of you every time it beats. I love you bigger than the sky. Grace, P.S. Daddy misses you too, but he won't say so. Can we mail it? Grace asked hopefully. Mrs. Rodriguez says she knows someone who works at the big building downtown where rich people live. Ethan looked at his daughter's hopeful face and realized that his pride had been costing her more than just Victoria's presence. It had been costing her the truth about love and sacrifice and what family really meant. That night, after Grace was asleep, Ethan sat at their small kitchen table and did something he hadn't done since Sarah's funeral. He cried. Not the controlled, silent tears he'd shed in hospital waiting rooms, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place he'd been carefully avoiding for months. He cried for Grace, who deserved a mother's love and had found it, only to lose it because her father was too proud to accept help. He cried for Victoria, who had offered everything she had and been rejected for her generosity. He cried for Sarah, who had asked him to find Grace a mother and had watched him drive that mother away. Most of all, he cried for himself, for the life he'd been too afraid to claim, for the love he'd been too stubborn to accept, for the family he'd destroyed because he couldn't bear to be vulnerable. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her father's penthouse, watching the rain blur Portland's lights into abstract patterns. She had been holding Grace's letter for 20 minutes, delivered by a cleaning woman who knew Mrs. Rodriguez, who knew someone who worked in the Sterling building. The construction paper felt fragile in her hands, made precious by small fingerprints, and the careful attention of a 7-year-old trying to bridge an impossible distance. Victoria had read it dozens of times, memorizing each word, each backwards letter, each spelling mistake that made it heartbreakingly authentic. I love you bigger than the sky. William found her there an hour later, still holding the letter, tears streaming down her face. Victoria? His voice carried a gentleness that had been rare since her childhood. What is it? She held out the letter without speaking. William read it carefully, his expression shifting from concern to something more complex, recognition perhaps, or regret. She's a remarkable child, he said quietly. She's dying. Victoria's voice was raw with pain. Not immediately, but without a transplant. And even if she gets one, she'll spend her whole life knowing that some stranger's money is the only reason she's alive. Ethan was right about that. Was he right about everything? Victoria turned to look at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. William Sterling was still an imposing figure, but the tremor in his left hand was more pronounced now, and there were moments when his sharp eyes lost focus, searching for something just beyond reach. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe we really are from different worlds. Maybe love isn't enough to bridge that kind of gap. William walked to stand beside her at the windows, their reflections ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. Your mother used to say that love was the only thing that could multiply when you divided it. Victoria looked at him in surprise. William rarely spoke about Margaret, and never with this kind of openness. She was right, you know, he continued. I loved her more after you were born, not less. But I was so afraid of losing her that I held on too tightly. When she got sick... He paused, struggling with memories that were becoming increasingly fragile. I tried to control everything, her treatment, her environment, her choices. I thought if I managed every detail perfectly, I could keep her safe. Dad, I couldn't save her, but I could have loved her better while I had the chance. William turned to face Victoria, his eyes clear and focused in a way they hadn't been for weeks. I've been making the same mistake with you, trying to protect you by controlling you, instead of trusting you to make your own choices about what kind of life is worth living. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of knots she'd been carrying for months. What are you saying? I'm saying that if Grace Murphy's father is half the man you believe him to be, he'll figure out that pride is a luxury he can't afford when it costs him his family. William smiled, and for a moment, Victoria could see the younger man who had won her mother's heart. And I'm saying that if my daughter has found love, real love, the kind that survives everything, including money, then she should fight for it. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Portland, washing the city clean for whatever would come next. In a penthouse 60 floors above the street, a father and daughter began to plan how love might conquer everything, even the fear that had kept them apart. And across the city, a single father sat at his kitchen table, writing a letter of his own. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered not by the postal service, but by William Sterling himself. Victoria watched from her office window as her father's Bentley pulled up outside the modest apartment building where Ethan and Grace lived, 68 floors below and a world away from Sterling Tech's gleaming headquarters. William Sterling had not set foot in a neighborhood like this since his own impoverished childhood, but he walked to the Murphy family's door with the same measured confidence he brought to corporate boardrooms. His designer suit looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of chain-link fences and cracked sidewalks, but his bearing remained unshaken. Ethan answered the door, still wearing his work clothes from the early morning shift at the office complex, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and wariness in rapid succession. Standing before him was the man whose money had saved his daughter's life and whose wealth represented everything Ethan could never provide. Mr. Murphy, William's voice carried none of the condescension Ethan had expected. "I have something that belongs to you." He held out a manila envelope with Ethan's name written across it in Victoria's careful handwriting. Ethan stared at it as if it might explode. "I'm not taking your money," Ethan said firmly. "It's not my money." William's smile was barely perceptible. "May I come in? This conversation is better had in private." Against his better judgment, Ethan stepped aside. William entered the small apartment, his sharp eyes taking in the carefully maintained space, the children's books on milk crate shelves, the drawings taped to the refrigerator, the medical equipment neatly organized in one corner. It was modest but clean, filled with the invisible markers of love that no amount of money could purchase. "Grace is at school?" William asked. "Until 3:30. Ethan remained standing near the door as if physical distance could protect him from whatever William Sterling had come to say. William settled into the second-hand armchair with surprising ease, looking more like a grandfather visiting family than a billionaire slumming in poverty. The tremor in his left hand was more pronounced today, but his voice remained steady. "My daughter is dying," he said without preamble. Ethan's defenses crumbled instantly. "What? But she's healthy. She's been working." "Not physically dying, spiritually, emotionally. She moves through her days like a ghost, performing all the right functions, but feeling nothing." William's clinical assessment was delivered with the precision of a medical diagnosis. "She eats because her body requires food. She works because her position demands it. She breathes because the alternative is unacceptable. But she's not living. I don't understand why you're telling me this. Because you're the only person who's ever made her truly alive." William leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "I built an empire to give my daughter everything money could buy, but I forgot to give her the one thing money can't purchase: the freedom to choose her own happiness." Ethan sat down heavily on the couch, suddenly feeling every one of his sleepless nights. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate what you've done for Grace, but Victoria and we're from different worlds. That doesn't change just because we have feelings for each other." "You're absolutely right. You are from different worlds." William's agreement was unexpected. "I was born in a world very much like yours. A tenement in South Boston, raised by a single mother who cleaned offices to keep us fed. Victoria was born into wealth and privilege, but worlds can be bridged, Mr. Murphy. The question is whether you have the courage to meet each other in the middle." The revelation that William Sterling had grown up poor shifted something in Ethan's understanding. He studied the older man's face, looking for traces of the boy who had known hunger and uncertainty. "Victoria never mentioned that. She doesn't know. I've spent 60 years burying that part of my past, convinced that my origins were something to be ashamed of rather than honored." William's voice carried a weight of regret. "My wife Margaret came from old money, Boston Brahmins who traced their lineage back to the Mayflower. When she chose to marry me, her family disowned her completely. That must have been difficult. It was the making of us. We built our life together from nothing, and every success felt earned because we'd started from the bottom." William paused, lost in memories that were becoming increasingly precious as they grew more fragile. "But after Victoria was born, I became obsessed with ensuring she'd never experience the vulnerability I'd known as a child. I forgot that vulnerability is what makes love possible." Ethan opened the manila envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not a check or legal document, but a letter written in Victoria's familiar script. "Ethan, I've spent 3 months learning what it feels like to have everything and nothing simultaneously. I have more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, but I can't afford the only things that matter: your trust, Grace's laughter, the sound of our family having dinner together. You were right that we're from different worlds. You were wrong that this makes love impossible. My mother gave up everything for love and never regretted it. She taught me that the only inheritance worth leaving is the knowledge that you chose love over fear again and again, even when it seemed impossible. I'm not asking you to take my money. I'm asking you to let me give you my heart, completely and without conditions. Grace needs parents who love each other as much as they love her. She deserves to see what it looks like when two people choose each other every day, regardless of the circumstances they were born into. The medical trust will remain anonymous and unconditional. Grace's health should never depend on our relationship status. But I want to earn my place in your family the way my mother earned hers in my father's, through love, commitment, and the willingness to build something new together. I'm learning to drive Ethan's pickup truck, still stalling at red lights. I'm taking cooking classes, burned only one pan this week. I'm volunteering at the Children's Hospital where I first understood what it meant to help someone without expecting anything in return. I'm becoming the woman you fell in love with, the one who exists when money doesn't matter and titles are irrelevant. The one who wants to pack Grace's lunch every morning and help with homework every evening and hold your hand through whatever comes next. If you'll have me, I want to come home, not to the penthouse but to apartment 2B, where my heart learned what family means. All my love, Victoria P.S. Grace's letter is attached. I carry it with me everywhere. Ethan's hands shook as he unfolded Grace's construction paper letter, the one he'd watched her write weeks ago. Seeing it now, worn soft from constant handling, he understood that Victoria had been carrying his daughter's love like a talisman. She quits Sterling Tech tomorrow, William said quietly. She's taking a position as a social worker with the county. The pay is approximately what you make as a janitor. Why would she do that? Because she's finally figured out who she wants to be when she grows up. William stood with the careful movements of someone fighting an invisible battle. I have early-stage Alzheimer's, Mr. Murphy. Some days I forget Victoria's name, but I never forget that she's happy when she's with your family. That kind of joy leaves a mark even memory loss can't erase. The admission hung in the small apartment like a confession. Ethan looked at this powerful man who was slowly losing the thing that defined him most, his mind, and recognized a father's desperate love. I'm sorry. That must be terrifying. What's terrifying is the thought that I might forget Margaret's face, or the sound of Victoria's laugh as a child. What's devastating is realizing I've spent 20 years so afraid of losing my daughter that I forgot to enjoy having her. William moved toward the door, then paused. Don't make my mistake, Mr. Murphy. Pride is a luxury none of us can afford when it costs us the people we love. After William left, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, reading Victoria's letter over and over. Through the thin walls, he could hear Mrs. Rodriguez's television and the sounds of normal life continuing around him. But inside his chest, something was shifting, fear giving way to possibility, pride transforming into hope. When Grace arrived home from school that afternoon, she found her father sitting at their small kitchen table with papers spread before him and an expression she hadn't seen since before her mother died. What's all this, Daddy? Plans, baby girl. Plans for our family. Grace climbed into his lap with the easy confidence of a child who had never doubted her father's love. Does this mean Vicky might come home? I think it might mean exactly that. That evening, Ethan did something he hadn't done in months. He called Sterling Tech's main number and asked to speak with Victoria Sterling. The receptionist was polite but firm. Ms. Sterling wasn't taking personal calls. Tell her it's Ethan Murphy, he said. Tell her Grace wants to show her how to balance rocks properly. The hold music seemed to last forever. When Victoria's voice finally came through the line, it sounded breathless and uncertain. Ethan, I got your letter, both of them. And? Ethan looked around their small apartment, at Grace's medical equipment in the corner, at Sarah's photo on the mantel, at the life they'd built from love and determination and hope. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was theirs. "And I think it's time for you to come home." The silence that followed was full of everything they couldn't say over the phone, forgiveness and fear and love that had survived separation and pride and the terrible arithmetic of inequality. "Are you sure?" Victoria's voice was small. "Really sure? Because I can't do this again, Ethan. I can't lose you and Grace a second time." "I'm sure." "We're sure." Grace had been listening shamelessly to his side of the conversation, and her excited whisper of, "Tell her I love her bigger than the sky," made him laugh for the first time in months. "Come home, Victoria. Come home to us." 60 floors above the city, Victoria Sterling pressed her forehead against her office window and watched the lights of Portland begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere down there, in an apartment she could afford on a social worker's salary, her family was waiting for her. "I'll be there in an hour," she whispered. "We'll be here," Ethan replied. "We'll always be here." As Victoria gathered her things and prepared to leave the corporate world behind, she thought about her mother's wisdom, that love was the only thing that multiplied when divided. Tonight, she would discover if a heart could expand large enough to hold everything that mattered, a man brave enough to accept help, a daughter wise enough to teach adults about family, and a future built not on money but on the radical act of choosing each other again and again, until choosing became as natural as breathing. Message for American seniors. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't losing someone you love. It's realizing you pushed them away because you were too proud to accept their help. If you're between 55 and 68, you've likely faced moments when stubborn independence cost you relationships that mattered. Maybe it was refusing your children's financial assistance, declining a friend's offer to drive you to appointments, or rejecting a partner's emotional support because accepting felt like admitting weakness. We convince ourselves that dignity means never needing anyone, but true dignity lies in allowing ourselves to be loved completely. The hardest lesson many of us learn too late is that pride can become a prison, isolating us from the very people who want to share our burdens. Love doesn't diminish when we accept help, it multiplies. The strongest families aren't those who never struggle, but those who struggle together. Your worth isn't measured by your ability to solve every problem alone, but by your courage to let others stand beside you when life gets overwhelming. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can say isn't, "I can handle this myself," but simply, "Thank you for caring enough to help." Real strength includes knowing when to lean on the people who love us. Discussion questions. Have you ever let pride prevent you from accepting help from someone who truly cared about you? What would you tell your younger self about the difference between independence and isolation? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences might help someone else realize they're not alone in this struggle. The wedding took place on a crisp Saturday morning in April at the small Presbyterian church where Sarah Murphy was buried. Victoria had wanted something simple, something that honored the family they'd built rather than the wealth she'd inherited. The pews were filled with an unlikely congregation, Ethan's co-workers from the office complex, Grace's classmates and their parents, Mrs. Rodriguez and her extended family, hospital staff who had watched their story unfold, and William Sterling sitting alone in the front row with tears streaming down his cheeks. Grace served as maid of honor, wearing a pale yellow dress that Victoria had helped her choose at the local department store. She carried a bouquet of daisies picked from the church garden, her small face serious with the weight of her important role. The heart monitor she still wore was hidden beneath the dress. its steady beeping a reminder of how far they'd all traveled to reach this moment. Victoria walked down the aisle without fanfare, wearing a simple ivory dress she'd bought at a consignment shop. No designer gown, no cathedral train, no string quartet. Just a woman choosing love over everything else she'd been taught to value. Her hand shook as she approached the altar where Ethan waited, handsome in his only suit, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The ceremony was officiated by Reverend Williams, who had known the Murphy family since Grace was born. His words were simple and direct, crafted for people who understood that marriage was less about grand gestures and more about daily choices to love each other through whatever came next. "Ethan and Victoria," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed countless unions and understood which ones would endure. "You come to this altar having already proven that love can survive separation, pride, and the fundamental differences that divide us. You've learned that marriage isn't about finding someone who completes you, but about choosing to be complete together." When it came time for vows, Ethan spoke first, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the promises he was making. "Victoria, when you walked into our lives, I thought you were going to save us. I didn't realize we were going to save each other." He reached for her hands, calloused fingers intertwining with soft ones. "I promise to meet you in the middle of whatever world we build together. I promise to accept your help with gratitude instead of pride. I promise to love Grace as fiercely as you do, and to love you as completely as she does, which is bigger than the sky." Victoria's vows came through tears she made no attempt to hide. "Ethan, you taught me that home isn't a place. It's the people who see you at your worst and choose to stay anyway. You gave me Grace, who showed me that love multiplies when you divide it. You gave me a family built on choice rather than obligation. I promise to choose you every day in every circumstance, whether we're rich or poor, healthy or sick, whether my father remembers my name or forgets it completely. I promise to build a life with you that Sarah would be proud of, and to love Grace as if she were mine from the moment she was born." Grace had insisted on adding her own vows to the ceremony, stepping forward when the rings were exchanged. "I promise to be the best daughter to both of you," she said solemnly, her 7-year-old voice carrying unexpected wisdom. "I promise to take my medicine and eat my vegetables and not complain too much when you make me do homework. And I promise to help you remember that families aren't perfect. They're just full of people who love each other anyway." The congregation laughed through their tears, and even Reverend Williams had to pause to compose himself before continuing. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the kiss was gentle and full of promise. Grace immediately inserted herself between them for a group hug that became the photograph William Sterling would treasure most in the months to come, when his memory began to fade, but his heart remembered the joy of watching his daughter choose happiness. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with spring flowers and filled with the kind of potluck feast that happens when a community comes together to celebrate. Mrs. Rodriguez had made enough tamales to feed half of Portland. The hospital staff contributed a cake shaped like a heart, and Grace's teacher brought homemade cookies frosted with the words "Murphy Family" in careful script. William Sterling sat at the head table, looking slightly out of place in his expensive suit, but unmistakably happy. His toast was brief, but heartfelt. "I built my fortune believing that money could solve any problem and buy any happiness. My daughter has taught me that the most valuable things in life, love, loyalty, family, can't be purchased or earned. They can only be given freely and received with gratitude." He raised his glass toward the newlyweds. "To Victoria and Ethan, who understand that true wealth is measured in the people who choose to stand beside you when everything else falls away." As the evening progressed, Victoria found herself watching the interactions around her with wonder. Grace moved between conversations with the confidence of a child who knew she was universally loved. Ethan talked easily with her former colleagues from Sterling Tech, finding common ground despite their vastly different backgrounds. William Sterling, in one of his increasingly rare lucid moments, was deep in conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez about the best strategies for managing difficult children. "No regrets?" Ethan asked, appearing at Victoria's elbow with 2 cups of punch. Victoria surveyed the scene, the modest church hall, the mismatched folding chairs, the cake that was slightly lopsided but made with love, and thought about the society wedding her father had originally planned. Crystal chandeliers and 1,000 guests, designer flowers, and a reception that would have cost more than most people's annual salary. "Not a single one," she said, meaning it completely. The dancing began with Frank Sinatra's "The Way You Look Tonight," played on an ancient sound system that crackled with every bass note. Victoria and Ethan swayed together in the small space cleared in the center of the hall, surrounded by their chosen family, both of them laughing when Ethan stepped on her feet. "I'm not much of a dancer," he apologized. "Neither am I. We'll learn together." Grace cut in halfway through the song, insisting that family dances required all family members. The 3 of them moved in a circle, Grace standing on Ethan's feet while Victoria spun them both, and the photographer captured the moment that would become the centerpiece of their mantle. Later, much later, after the last guest had gone home and the church hall had been cleaned, the 3 of them sat in their car outside the small house Victoria had bought in Grace's neighborhood. It was modest by Sterling standards, but spacious by Murphy measurements. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a backyard big enough for Grace to practice her rock-balancing skills. "So this is really happening," Ethan said, staring up at the house that would be their first shared home. "Getting cold feet," Victoria teased. "Warming them up, actually." He turned to look at her, this woman who had given up everything to choose them. "I love you, Mrs. Murphy." "I love you too, Mr. Murphy." From the back seat, Grace piped up with the practical concerns of childhood. "Can I pick which room is mine? And can we get a dog? And will Grandpa William come visit us?" Victoria and Ethan exchanged glances over their daughter's head. William's Alzheimer's was progressing, and his good days were becoming rarer. But for now, he was managing with the help of full-time care, and yes, he would visit as often as his condition allowed. "Yes to the room, maybe to the dog, and absolutely to Grandpa William," Victoria said. "This is his granddaughter's house, too." As they walked up the path to their new home, Grace skipping ahead to explore the front porch, Victoria felt the weight of the day settling into contentment. She had started the morning as Victoria Sterling, trust fund heiress and corporate executive. She was ending it as Victoria Murphy, social worker and mother, wife to a man who loved her completely, and stepmother to a child who had taught her that family was a choice you made every day. The house smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. Grace immediately claimed the bedroom with windows facing the backyard, declaring it perfect for watching sunrises. Ethan and Victoria stood in the doorway of what would be their shared room, holding hands like teenagers. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and discover this was all a dream," Victoria admitted. "If it is, don't wake up," Ethan replied, pulling her close. "I like this dream better than any reality I've ever known." That night, as they tucked Grace into her new bed, she made an announcement that perfectly captured the transformation they'd all undergone. "I'm going to tell everyone at school that I have the best family in the world," she said sleepily. "Not because we have money or a big house, but because we chose each other, and we never gave up." Victoria kissed Grace's forehead, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood dreams. "Sweet dreams, baby girl. Sweet dreams, Mom." The word hung in the air like a benediction. Victoria had been called many things in her 28 years. Daughter, heiress, executive, fiancée, but mother was the title that fit most perfectly, the role she had been preparing for her entire life without realizing it. As Ethan turned off the light and they tiptoed out of Grace's room, Victoria thought about Sarah Murphy's final request, that Ethan find Grace a mother who would love her unconditionally. Looking back, she realized Sarah's wisdom had been profound. Love wasn't something you found. It was something you became, one choice at a time, until choosing love became as natural as breathing. Outside, Portland settled into sleep around them, a city full of families facing their own struggles and celebrations. But inside the small house on Maple Street, three people who had found each other against all odds were finally, completely, and absolutely home.